Okay, awesome. Thank you. So in the year 2000, Netflix had roughly 300,000 subscribers and wasn't profitable. Blockbuster had 7,700 stores across North America and was extremely profitable. But by the year 2013, Netflix had amassed 32 million subscribers, and Blockbuster declared bankruptcy and exited the business. Why is it some organizations and individuals thrive during a period of rapid technological change, while others struggle to keep up? This is the question I've been asking myself for the last decade or more. In 2011, as you heard, I co-founded an organization at the time called Ladies Learning Code. We then evolved from Ladies Learning Code to Canada Learning Code, and we taught people from age 3 to 93 technical skills. Everything from how to build a website, how to query SQL or SQL, and early model artificial intelligence and machine learning models. We also work with organizations like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Scotiabank, TELUS, and even the federal government. I've had the privilege of being part of numerous roundtables and advisory councils and dinner conversations about how are we going to prepare people for the future of work. I was even part of the G7's first Innovation 7 on this very topic. And in all of those conversations, we always come back to the same aha, right? If we're going to help people thrive in the future of work, we need people to be lifelong learners. Right? Lifelong learners, they say, right, help foster a nation of lifelong learning. Let's help people from hire to retire. Right? And it's not just all of us in these advisory groups or roundtables. There was a recent survey of Canadians that said that 98% of them agree that lifelong learning was important for their future. And it's not just us Canadians either. UNESCO was the first international organization to put lifelong learning on the map back in 1972. We've been talking about lifelong learning for a very long time, but organizations and individuals, still the best and well-intended, often fall short from that goal. Because here's the thing. I believe that our current understanding and model of lifelong learning is not enough. It's not complete. As Albert Einstein once said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. What I've realized over the last decade, and the insight that I'm here to share with all of you, is that what we actually need is we need people, teams, organizations, and cultures that are willing to do things differently, even if it means going against everything that they've ever known. So I want to start with a bit of a game. Usually this goes well, sometimes it backfires, but I'm going to hope it goes well today. I love going to my local fair, and one of my favorite things is going to that person who tries to guess your age and guess your weight. Okay? So I'm going to try to guess your age and guess your weight. Okay? I see some faces of panic. I'm not going to guess the weight part, just the age, okay? So what I'm going to ask you to do in a minute is I'm going to ask you to put your hand up if you've had a job in a similar line of work for 2 years or more. So hands up if you've had a job, same line of work, 2 years or more. Okay. Keep your hand up if it's 5 years or more. Okay. 10 years or more. Okay. This is the fun part. I'm going to guess that you're probably between the ages of 43 and 59. How'd I do? Yes. Okay. That is what the research would tell us, right? Those individuals who've had a job at the same company in the same line of work for 10, 12, 20 years or more are likely to be Gen X or boomers. Because children today and people today are going to have 15 different jobs or more. So this is where I came to this first understanding of lifelong learning and skilling people for the future. And this is the model that we often started with. It's called the T model, kind of looks like an I, but it's this idea that in our school-age years, we learn deep expertise in one area, and that would have carried us for the rest of our career. Yes, we'll learn broad competencies, new skills and abilities, maybe we learn to manage in our field, but generally, what you learned in your early school-age years, 25-ish or so, will carry you for the rest of your life. Okay? But what we know is that's not the reality anymore. We know that the first, second, and third industrial evolutions, steam, assembly line, computers, have shifted the way that we need to think about work and the evolution of work. It is expected that those first 3 industrial revolutions took about 250 years. What McKinsey suggests is that the last decade was faster in pace than the 100 years that came before it. What we know about the last few years is that e-commerce, as an example, made strides in a matter of weeks and months that we were expecting would take 10 years. Right? The pace of change is rapid and more rapid than it's ever been, and work is evolving quicker and quicker and quicker than it ever has. So I needed to think about a different model for understanding learning and skilling. And so in comes the M model. Right? Here, we're building on the model before, and what it represents is how we think about lifelong learning and reskilling right now. Right? You might develop some deep expertise early in your school-aged years, but you're going to, at different points in your career, have to reskill and learn something new. You're going to have to develop deep expertise at different points. Right? And this is more like the reality we face right now. Right? Children that are born today, like my 2-year-old daughter, they're estimated to have 40 different jobs in 10 different industries. And 65% of those jobs haven't even been created yet. We are on the verge of a reskilling crisis, according to the World Economic Forum. The pace of change is so rapid, and we will need 1 billion people to reskill by 2030. Why do some individuals and organizations thrive during periods of rapid technological change, while others struggle to keep up? And how do we ensure that everybody gets to keep up? I kept going back to this idea of Blockbuster and Netflix. So show of hands here, who's been into a physical Blockbuster before? Okay, my boomers and Gen Xers, right? I'm sad to report I teach undergraduate students at the Ivey School of Business at Western University. And I'm sad to report that now when I ask this, when I teach a case on Blockbuster and Netflix, most students have never been into a Blockbuster. And so usually when I ask, I'll be like, yeah, no, me neither. And I'm hide my BlackBerry under the desk. No, I'm joking. It's a Google Pixel. But really, the reality, if it's not because of age, you may not have been in a Blockbuster before. So let me tell you a little bit about what that experience is like. Okay, so Blockbuster, you would maybe after school on a Friday, let's say, your parent, your older sibling, caregiver would pick you up. You'd get into your vehicle or you'd get on the bus and you'd go to your nearest Blockbuster store, a bricks and mortar store. There you would be greeted with shelves and shelves and shelves of VHS or DVDs, mostly of new release movies that you could then rent for a period of time. You would probably fight if you had a sibling, or fight with yourself if you're, some of us, and you would pick a movie that you wanted to watch. You'd go to the checkout line, you'd grab some snacks and some, refreshments on the way out. You'd get home, you'd pop that in, and you'd be watching your favorite movie, right? Blockbuster was counting on you not being so punctual and not returning those movies on time. There were tons and tons of late fees if you didn't return it on time. They also were expecting you to pick up those refreshments along the way. So when Netflix came on the scene in 1997, what their model was is you'd go online and you'd pick out a movie you wanted to watch, and they would mail you, in the mail, a DVD. Okay? And at first, Blockbuster didn't really think that much of Netflix. Okay? Because if you think about it, at first, Netflix was actually good for Blockbuster's business. Blockbuster was limited by shelf space. Right? And it had these new releases. The new releases, if you remember, cost more, and they usually had a shorter return period, right? So if you didn't return it on time because you wanted to watch it again that weekend, you were going to end up paying Blockbuster big money. That's how they made most of their money. But Netflix also appealed to what we call a niche customer. There are people who didn't care about watching that movie instantly. They didn't want to pay late fees. And they also were maybe interested in some of the more classic type of movies that actually just sort of hogged shelf space on Blockbuster's stores. So at first, Blockbuster was like, well, Netflix is actually good for our bottom line. But as we know, technological advancements happened, consumer preferences advanced, and all of a sudden, Netflix made its way into streaming. It also started appealing to more and more people. More and more people wanted to access their movies in this way. And by that time, Blockbuster, who tried to do the whole streaming thing, couldn't keep up. As we think about this idea of technological disruption, the researchers who study this, Clay Christensen being one of the most well-known, see this similar pattern happen time and time again, where organizations, they can't unlearn the way that they've always done things. See, what happened is that Blockbuster got so close to their customer, the one that wanted new releases, the one that would pay the late fees and would buy the pops and snacks. Their whole business processes, the way that they ran as an organization, continued to reinforce the way that they've always done things, right? And they weren't able to keep up. This isn't just a Blockbuster and Netflix thing either. Netscape Navigator, right, lost that battle to Internet Explorer and Chrome and Firefox. We've got our beloved Canadian darling, the BlackBerry. We have examples of Kodak, Nokia, IBM, and early mainframe computers. This pattern of disruption keeps happening time and time again because organizations are stuck doing things the way they've always done it. And this is in contrast to organizations who do this differently. I'll use Apple as another good example. They were the leader in the music streaming device with the iPod. But they realized that they needed to disrupt before they got disrupted. And so Steve Jobs and the team at Apple, they invested time, energy, money, resources, everything into building the iPhone, right? They were willing to cannibalize the thing that was going really well for them. Most businesses would have just kept riding on the joys of the iPod, but they realized that they needed to be innovative and do things differently to, again, disrupt before they got disrupted later. So I needed a different model to think about this, right? We've got all of this disruption happening. We have some organizations and individuals who thrive during periods of change and others who don't. And why is that? And how can we learn about what those who do can apply to everybody else? So introducing the S model. We've got the T, the M, and the S. I'm not going to go through the alphabet, don't worry. I have like one more model, but this is the it. So this is a way of thinking about learning or lifelong learning. Right? That M model for me was just not complete because it was still so discrete at points in time in which you reskill. But when we think about what it takes to learn and be lifelong learners, it's really a process that's not as linear as that, right? So zooming in to these moments of deep expertise is a model like this S curve, right? So you have a period of time on the bottom and you have growth on the y-axis. So as you start learning a new skill, you don't really know that much. But as time elapses, usually that learning curve is super, super steep. You probably fail along the way. I know, like, for example, parenting for me, the learning curve was very, very steep. So you fumble along the way, and then eventually you get to a point where you feel comfortable with something. Okay? When I think about this like rapid period of technological change, and I think about the stat, 42% of jobs are going to be highly impacted by automation, and many are going to be displaced. I think about the need for us to be and ride on these S curves. I also think about my work teaching hundreds of thousands of people technical skills through Canada Learning Code, and I started to see these patterns emerge of the types of people that would come to our experiences. For one period of time, back in like 2013, 2014, we actually used to joke that we would rebrand to Journalist Learning Code because we had so many journalists coming to our workshops. That was at a period of time where sort of media transitioned from sort of traditional print to online media. And then all of a sudden, even though they were in the same field of work and in the same industry, their jobs were completely changing. And the learning curve for them was exceptionally steep. This model, though, for me was still incomplete. And the aha for me was when I tried to teach my late father how to use his phone. Okay. So I'll tell you a little bit about my dad. He came to Canada from Croatia when he was 16 years old. He had the equivalent of maybe a grade 6 education. He located in London, Ontario, started working at the Ford Motor Assembly plant just outside of town, and he worked on the assembly line for 32 years straight, and then he retired. He realized, okay, I've got a lot of years left in me. I need to probably learn how to use this technology, these phones, these devices. So I said, okay, Dad, I'll teach you how to make a call. Got him a phone, taught him to make a call. We fumbled for weeks, months to try to figure out how to use and make calls successfully. And then the moment that he did, he had to move on to learn something else. But that wasn't even the moment that was the biggest aha. For me, it was the day that he came home with his dream car, the 2021 Ford Bronco. It's not an autonomous vehicle. It's not a hybrid vehicle. It's not an electric vehicle. But it has some of those early technologies, adaptive cruise control, Copilot 360, so the beginnings of an autonomous vehicle. And that is when it hit me. Okay? I didn't get to capture my dad's reaction, but I found a video that I think captures what would happen pretty well.
Terrified woman freaks out behind the wheel of a car driving itself.
It's
70-year-old Shirley looks like she's about to lose it as the car's autopilot does the driving.
Oh, dear Jesus. I could never. Oh, where's it going?
You can hear her son, Bill Rimmer, laughing at his mom's reaction after he activated the autopilot on his brand new electric-powered Tesla. Rimmer videotaped everything.
Oh, my God. Oh, this is so scary. Oh, Jesus, this is my first day out, and I'm about to die.
Oh, come on, relax.
So not exactly my dad's reaction, but it's pretty close. The learning curve is super steep, right? Like it's super steep, especially when we think about technological advancements. So that happened, and my dad trying to figure out this adaptive cruise control, trying to figure out how to use apps in his car. And I realized that not only is the learning curve steep, but we actually have to jump to new learning curves all of the time, right? The moment my dad figured out the one app to phone, he wanted to level up in video chat, okay? So the learning, you jump on a new curve, you have to learn something, and you start back at square one. But another thing was happening at that time when I was teaching people across the country. I started to see teachers working with students in their classroom, teaching them things like coding. And I started to realize there were like two distinct groups of people that emerged, two distinct groups of teachers, right? There were the ones who were not taught how to use technology growing up, were kind of fearful, stumbled with a smart screen, didn't want to interact. They were used to being the sage on the stage, right? They were used to feeling as though they needed to have all of the answers. But then I noticed something really interesting and transformational happening, was a group of teachers who realized that, these kids know way more about technology than I'm ever going to know, and let them lead the class. Let them explore and fumble and hack and play with all these different technologies. And they went from being the instructor that knew all of the answers to not even a facilitator, but to a lead learner. So there was something interesting that was happening. And I looked at this model and I said, this is more than just them jumping curves to learn how to do something. Because the thing about this model that I think we've got wrong is that it moves upwards. Right? It assumes that the knowledge that you have can be built on, and that the knowledge that you have can be useful into the future, and that it doesn't depreciate, right? But again, I think that's where we've got it all wrong. We need, and what I saw in those teachers were people who were willing to unlearn the way that they've always done things. I always think about the example of unlearning, or talk about it a little bit like learning to ride a bike. Okay? We talk about learning to ride a bike like knowledge doesn't expire. It doesn't depreciate, right? You learn to ride a bike, you can ride a bike forever, right? But what happens if the circumstances around riding a bike change, or if riding a bike is no longer useful or valuable to you? So this next example, I think, will show you a little bit about what I mean. Oh, we gotta get.
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like riding a bike, meaning it's really easy and you can't forget how to do it, right? But I did something. I did something that damaged my mind. It happened on the streets of Amsterdam, and I got really scared, honestly. I can't ride a bike like you can anymore. Before I show you the video of what happened, I need to tell you the backstory. Like many 6-year-olds with a MacGyver mullet, I learned how to ride a bike when I was really young. I had learned a life skill and I was really proud of it. Everything changed though when my friend Barney called me 25 years later. Where I work, the welders are geniuses and they like to play jokes on the engineers. He had a challenge for me. He had built a special bicycle and he wanted me to try to ride it. He had only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left. I thought this would be easy, so I hopped on the bike, ready to demonstrate how quickly I could conquer this.
And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Destin Sandlin. First attempt riding the bicycle.
All right. So, faster I go, the better. Yeah.
I couldn't do it. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually really frustrated.
And he wasn't the only one that was frustrated. He's taken this bike around the world. And every time people try to jump on, confident that they can ride it, the same thing happens. They can't. He says it took him 8 months to learn how to ride this new bike, right? This is a demonstration of what unlearning is, right? It's not just forgetting. Okay? Unlearning is this process that individuals and organizations do to acknowledge and release prior learning in order to accommodate new information, skills, and knowledge. Unlearning is not just forgetting. There are broadly two types of unlearning that I want to introduce to all of you today. The first is called wiping. Okay? This is a type of unlearning habit that happens when some external event forces us to unlearn. Anybody here work in person and then have to go remote in the last 3 years or so? Yes? Okay. Yes, we've all experienced to some degree this unlearning that happens because we are forced to unlearn, right? But what I think is more transformational is a second type of unlearning, deep unlearning. It's the kind of unlearning that happens from within. So in other words, we have this like, uh-oh kind of unlearning, and we have the aha type of unlearning. Now, before I get into sharing a little bit about this, again, the model and understanding for unlearning wasn't complete, right? I showed you this T or I model, the M model, the S model. This is still the S curve, all right? I promise no alphabet, more alphabet, but this is a modification to this S curve, what I call the unlearning curve. And what it does, you'll see this little blip here, is an intentional process of unlearning built into the way we think about lifelong learning. Why does this matter? Why is the unlearning curve important? I'll tell you a little bit about that now. If we learn without unlearning, I think there are a host of problems as we think about how we thrive and how our individuals, teams, our organizations thrive in the face of change. And I think there's broadly three things. The first, it reinforces existing biases. The second is it emphasizes individual responsibility over systems or collective. And then I just don't think it's disruptive enough. So let me tell you about these one by one. Reinforcing existing biases. You can think of your brain as the most beautifully curated, well-organized library. I will tell you this is not what mine looks like. But your brain is like a library, and every book on the shelf is a new piece of data, information, or skill. Your brain is built and to categorize and put away everything nice and neatly. Right? It doesn't want books along the, scattered along the ground or not away in the shelves. It's going to take whatever you put into your brain, whatever you bring to that library, it's going to find some way to categorize and put it away nicely on the shelf, right? It's going to find a shortcut. And this is the thing, is that our brains are hardwired to do this, right? We have all sorts of biases. Sunk cost fallacy, you might have heard it, where when we invest time and energy in something, we're more likely to keep doing it because we've invested time and energy in something. A confirmation bias, where we look purposely for information that confirms what we already know. There are all of these quirks, all of these shortcuts that reinforce us to do things the way we've always done it. So that's the first problem that I see. If we learn without unlearning, is that we're going to keep on reinforcing the types of biases, the types of processes, the types of thinking that we've done in the past. And that's not enough in the face of the future. The second reason is that when we think about lifelong learning as that curve, and we talk about it as help people learn, help people from hire to retire, we start to overemphasize an individual's responsibility in the learning process and forget about the systems and the teams that contribute to that learning as well. These are some learners from my time at Canada Learning Code, but this is a good example of why I think this is so problematic. We know that in Canada right now, in ICT roles, less than a quarter of them are held by women. We know it's even lower for Black, Indigenous, persons with disabilities, other racialized groups, right? There are a lot of reasons why there are underrepresentation of certain people in these fields. But as I've talked to people, as I've helped people learn these skills, as I've worked with organizations, as studied this, I start to realize that there are a whole bunch of reasons why women as one group leave this space, right? At a point in time, the unemployment rate with a woman with a STEM degree was higher than those without it. Yet we have a massive shortage of people with tech skills. Well, it turns out that there are all these processes and systems in place, hiring, credentialing, that force these groups from staying in these spaces or from accessing these types of skills. And we know that so much work and so much learning happens at work that it's so important that we don't think about lifelong learning as something that continues to overemphasize an individual learning a new skill, but thinks about the way that the organizations that they're part of sets them up to learn something new as well. And the last one is, I just don't think it's disruptive enough in the face of the type of change that we're experiencing right now. And I use this example of a cake. Okay? Now, I think we can probably all agree AI is having a moment right now, right? We're in the moment of AI. But we could talk about cloud, we could talk about a lot of different transformations, but I think AI is particularly relevant as we think about what the future of change is going to look like. AI adoption right now in Canada is very, very low, and it's half that of other countries around the world. But when I talk to people and we think about this, and this has been going on for quite some time, we often think about technology advancements like AI as kind of icing on a cake, right? But really, the disruptive nature of these types of technologies, and AI specifically, is not just icing on the cake, but it's actually the flour that's baked inside the cake. Right? These types of changes that are happening and right beneath us are so disruptive and again, so much more embedded in the way that we currently think about it. So if we keep applying the way that we think about learning and skills and retraining right now, I just don't think it's disruptive enough to deal with these types of changes. So it reinforces our existing bias if we learn without learning, right? It overemphasizes an individual's responsibility without thinking about how teams and organizations contribute to this. And it's really just not disruptive enough, I think, in the face of current change. So what do we need next, right? We're back to the unlearning curve. What do we need to do in order to unlearn? I propose this idea of a learning leap. What's a learning leap? Good question. A learning leap is the intentional action that we take, right? That disrupts our usual way of doing something to learn something new. How we unlearn? We take learning leaps, okay? Before I talk about what those learning leaps are, I want to remind us a little bit about where learning happens in the context of work. And when we think about, again, the types of technological change, organizations and individuals, how we help them keep up, right? You might have heard of the 70-20-10. 10% of learning happens formally, right, in a post-secondary program, maybe vocational program. 20% of your learning typically happens socially, and 70% of it happens at work. 70% of learning, reskilling, training, will happen at work. So as I share these next slides, I want you to think about a recent project that you've been part of. Maybe a big project, a small project, maybe it's a personal project, maybe it's a work project, and I want you to think about that as I share what's next. Before I talk about the kind of leaps that are worth taking, I want to talk about what is going to prevent us from taking these leaps. So, first thing are the personal reasons that prevent us as individuals from taking the learning leaps that we need to take into the future. First one, our biases. I talked about this already, but our human quirks, it's important for us to know, reinforce us doing things the way that we've always done them. We want to be right. Our ego, realistically, right? We don't want to maybe take a leap and undo something that we know because we want to be right, and there's a risk that we might not be if we do something that's different or something that we don't know. That learning curve is really steep. We might not be as curious as we once were. That's a reality. I think about my daughter who's like a sponge and soaks everything up and is asking why? And I'm like, when was the last time I actually asked about something working, right? So our lack of curiosity can also prevent us from taking learning leaps. And then the last one I think we all probably felt really heavily is uncertainty. It becomes really hard to take learning leaps when we're just not sure what's going to happen along the other side. As teams, there's a whole other set of complexity in the types of reasons why teams are not willing to take learning leaps. First one is our leadership conditioning or our orientation to an organization, right? We have been brought into an organization or we've learned how to do work, and it prevents us from doing something different. We get comfortable with doing that. Right? We also have a lot of silos, right? And a lack of collaboration. The research is really clear that if we want to unlearn, the best way to do that is to challenge the way that we think about things. And when we don't work with people from across different organizations or even people in our teams, remote work makes this hard, then we're never really challenged in the way we think or do something. So a lack of collaboration or silos certainly prevents teams from taking these leaps. Rewards and recognition. We are incentivized to keep doing things the way we've always done them. Right? As teams, we value the outcome. We want people to make progress and success. So we're often continuing to do things and we reward the types of behaviors that continue to do things the way that they've always been done. And this leads me to the last one, right? We put in a lot of process and bureaucracy, like, yep, check boxes that we have to check that just reinforce a team doing things the way that we've always done them. And then lastly, organizationally, I'll touch on a few of these. And some of these are related to teams, but largely organizations, they lack strategic clarity, right? We like to think that we know where we're going as organizations and that we have this grand vision and everybody knows the vision. But as Alice in Wonderland once said, if you don't know where you're going, any path will take you there. And when organizations and teams aren't clear about where they're going, we will just keep going the way that we came, right? There's no reason for us to change course. We also know that there's really rigid decision-making that happens in organizations, bureaucracy, but specifically at an organizational level. We know that there is a tendency for organizations not to cannibalize what they've already done, right? So Apple is a great example. They were willing to go away with their most popular media streaming device, the iPod, to invest in something else, even if it meant that they were going to lose sales of their iPod, right? This is Blockbuster's challenge, right? And a lot of the companies that have been disrupted is they're not willing to forego the thing that's working really well to make space for something new. And then lastly, just a general risk-averse culture, right? We know the number one way that organizations thrive in the face of technological change is that they're willing to take risks. They're willing to embrace failure. They're willing to do things differently. Okay? So by now, if you're thinking about your latest project or your latest, activity at home or personally, you're probably, if I'm right, like most times I give this talk, being like, yeah, no, I mean, these biases they're real. These barriers are real, right? Most people will say that will never work here, right? There is so much of those barriers at place in my organizations and in my life that will never work, right? Unlearning is never going to work. But that's what people said about Netflix too. Right? This is one of the co-founders' book, right, about the Netflix journey. That will never work, right? That's what people said about organizations who were able to thrive in the face of change, individuals who were able to thrive in the periods of rapid technological growth. There is a way, absolutely, for us as people, as teams and organizations to unlearn. So, back to the learning leaps. I have worked with hundreds of thousands of people, teaching them technical skills. I've done research on organizations or teaching leveraging technology, and I found what I think are the three most profound, most important types of learning leaps that are worth taking as teams, as people, and as organizations. Okay? The first one is stay curious. Okay? Maybe it goes without saying, you've probably heard the idea of a growth mindset. Carol Dweck coined this term 30-some years ago. This idea that what you know and your skills are not innate, you can learn, you can be curious. But this one I find is the one that is often one we forget about, right? It can be as simple as diversifying the type of information you read. You get up every morning, you read the Globe and Mail, you read the Hill Times, go find something radically different. I think about this one a lot as a parent as well, right? I always talk to my daughter about what does she want to be when she grows up, but really 65% of the jobs haven't been created yet. What I should be trying to foster is not necessarily a love for the job or even a love for the solutions of problems, but I should be curious and focused on the bigger things that we want to solve, right? Stay curious and diversify the type of information that comes to you. This is absolutely important for organizations and individuals who thrive in the face of technological change. Now, you're wondering, okay, how does an organization do this? Well, Microsoft is a great example of this. Satya Nadella came into the organization and he inherited what he has coined a know-it-all organization. Right? You might be part of teams or I have a family that is a bit of a know-it-all family, and they were focused on being right? And they've set up all of their processes and all of their systems to be right, to look good, right? And he focused on fostering through incentives and others a learn-it-all culture, right? A growth mindset. And so there are ways that you can, in teams and as organizations, focus on prioritizing what people know and what they learn and unlearn, and not just having the right answers to get to the right outcome. Okay? So this is the first major learning leap I think is worth taking. Stay curious in different ways. Okay? The second one is to really focus on challenging best practices. I used to call this abandoning best practices, but then that was pretty controversial. So challenging best practices, right? We know that we have a bias and a tendency to do things the way that they've always been done, right? But we have an opportunity to do things differently. When we think about one of the biggest problems that I think learning without learning faces is that it overemphasizes an individual's responsibility to learn and doesn't prioritize the collective. Challenging best practices is a really great way for us to do that, right? Think about credentialing, think about hiring, think about the ways in which you bring people into the organization. Some of you in this room are going to be way more familiar with this than me, but I did some reading on Talent Cloud, a project in the federal government, right? That was built by a group of people who wanted to increase the speed to hire, wanted to build diversity in from the get-go, and really had to challenge the way that we've always done hiring, right? Another example of the types of best practices that might be worth challenging are even the way that we skill and train people to begin with, right? I call it the Netflix for learning, right? We often are sent to this link and then we go online and we have to watch a video and we go through some activities and we learn, we pick what type of learning we want, right? The research though shows that when we think about unlearning and the types of conditions that will support us to unlearn, that it's actually best done with other people in cohorts, right? So work integrated learning is super essential. Cohort-based learning is super important. I think we even need to rethink and unlearn the way that we've set up how we are reskilling and training people if we truly want them to thrive in the face of the future. Learning leap that I think is really important to take is to measure the quality of decision making and not just the outcomes. What I mean by this is we often, when we do something, a new project, maybe the one that you reflected on, we really focus on the outcome, right? Was that good or was it bad? But we know from the research of organizations and then even individuals who thrive in the period of rapid change is that they are willing to take risks, they're willing to fail, and that encourages them to be innovative. So what we can do as individuals, what we can do as teams and organizations is to move away from just valuing, prioritizing, measuring, and rewarding the outcome of something, but focus on prioritizing, rewarding, valuing how we got there, right? Did we finish a project and then move on to the next one? Or did we stop and say, what happened in that project that we don't want to do again? What do we need to unlearn about the way we did something before? A retrospective. And if we focus on valuing and we focus on prioritizing, rewarding the process of doing something, it creates so much more of the conditions for us to take the risks and be innovative, right? Netflix is a great example of this, right? People thought that Netflix would never work, right? They have built the type of culture in which decision-making is very autonomous, but they do this. They prioritize the process of making decisions. They want people to exhaust the options. They want people to look at what happened in the past, right? I think it's important for us to learn about that, but they want to make sure we tried and they thought about every new innovative alternative and then make a really good decision. Even if the outcome may not be favorable, at least you value and you reward the process of getting there. So I think that's absolutely essential for teams and organizations, but I even think about that as an individual myself, right? Am I putting an overemphasis on where I'm going, or am I letting myself take risks, embrace failure, and unlearn the things that I've known to do things differently? So as I conclude today, I want to just leave you with one more thought. We know that the pace of change is going to be quicker than it's ever been before, right? The one thing that's constant is change, right? We know that the pace of change is accelerating. We know that there are individuals who are going to thrive, and we want everybody to thrive in that pace of change. So I want us to think, though, about the future as not necessarily just a destination, but as a journey for us to get there. Right? We absolutely have the ability for us to unlearn and relearn and to do things differently. We have the ability to help people to thrive in the face of technological change. So for me, it's not a matter of how, it's a matter of whether we are willing and we are ready as individuals and organizations to take those learning leaps. Are we willing to stay curious? Are we willing to challenge best practices? And are we willing to, again, value innovation, risk-taking, and curiosity? Okay. As we think about, and as you go from here, I challenge you to go and leave this room and think about the one place in your personal or professional life where you can take a learning leap. Where can you challenge the way that you've been thinking about something, and where can you open yourself up to something new? Because what I found is that the best way for us to start thinking differently is to start acting differently, taking those leaps, right? I truly believe in the power of unlearning to help us help everybody in Canada thrive in a period of technological change. And I believe that our collective ability can make that happen, but we need to do that one learning leap at a time. Thank you.
Check.
Hello?
Melissa, thank you so much for this outstanding presentation, so insightful. I'd like to invite our in-person audience to ask questions. If we don't have any, I'm going to grab some questions from our online audience.
Awesome.
Do we have any
Comments?
questions?
Don't be shy. Okay, great. And I'm like sort of blinded by the light, so I might have to.
Since your organization, Canada Learning to Code, I was wondering if you worked with an individual called Gabe Braden.
Oh, the name's familiar, but we work with lots of individuals.
Yeah,
in Ottawa here?
Yeah, he's a university student at
Yeah,
Ottawa
okay.
U with an organization called Steampunk Learning, I
Okay,
believe.
yeah, okay,
And it's
cool.
similar to yours, so I was wondering if you two work
Awesome.
together.
Awesome. Yeah, possibly. We've been really fortunate to collaborate in every province and territory with teachers, with technology leaders. So yeah, we'll chat with you after. Yeah, it's great. Any other questions?
Okay, so we do have a couple of questions from the online audience. So the first one is, how can educational institutions and governments better prepare students for the jobs and technologies of the future?
Okay. How can governments and educational institutions help prepare people for the future? Well, I mean, I think unlearning is a huge piece. The one thing that comes to mind for me for that most readily is when we think about, again, AI or ChatGPT. There's so many conversations right now about whether or not we use these tools in classrooms. And I think our first tendency is to say no. But I think that's where we need to really unlearn maybe a way of the past and to embrace some of these new technologies and embrace this that lead learner environment in classrooms specifically, where we don't need to have all the answers, but we can actually try and find those answers with our students, with our children as well. And I think the government also has a role to play. I was really encouraged to see the code of conduct around AI and some of the things that we need in place. But I think the big thing, or my big takeaway, and what I see in individuals and organizations is just we need to continue to challenge to do those things a little bit differently, right? And not just kind of go to our default assumption or default instinct to put another, standard operating procedure or another policy, but, remember, okay, this is a moment for us to think a lot more radically about whether or not that actually serves us and our students or our citizens as we go into the future.
Thank you, Melissa. So the next question is, do you have any great examples of organizations or individuals that have embraced unlearning and thrived as a result?
Yes. Yeah, so I think I talked in a little bit of those. Again, we use Netflix and Blockbuster a lot as a really good example of disruption, but and then we think about what to do and not to do. And Netflix, I mean, some people will say or ask me the question, well, haven't they had a bit of a rocky path? With Hulu and HBO Max and Disney Plus and all of these, but they are still the streaming service that has the largest share of the market, and so they are clearly figured something out, right? They are still willing to disrupt before disrupted, and I think the best example of that was their move to streaming. DVDs was lucrative for them; it worked well for them, but they were still willing to invest in that. Again, Microsoft, American Airlines, actually, interestingly, I was reading about this not that long ago. Throughout the pandemic, they were in a matter of weeks able to, stand up kiosks. Their development team on their AA website, they implemented an agile methodology, and they were able to start releasing, updates in multiple times a week. There are lots of examples, and not just entire organizations, but specific teams within organizations. Because I think that's one thing that is important to note is that the bigger an organization gets, absolutely the harder it is to influence an organizational culture. Like that is true. Organizational psychologists will say that's very much the case. But what they'll also say is that you can always influence subcultures, and that becomes super important. So the way that teams, even small teams, interact in organizations and the actions that they take can start to shift the fabric of those organizations. So even if you look at, maybe some of your teams, or again, I point to the Talent Cloud project that's happening, like there are these small little pockets, and I think we just need more of us to take those leaps and more of us to start acting differently for us to see that on a larger scale. So there's examples everywhere, really.
Okay, I'm going to invite the audience again to give them a chance, and if not, I'm going to ask one question that I have. What have you unlearned in your career?
Oh, I feel like I'm always unlearning. Well, I think the one piece for me of unlearning, and this might resonate with some of you, is actually very personal, and it's the way that I characterize or think about myself. So I'll give an example. We at Canada Learning Code, we were launching this really big project or big initiative. We have a fleet that drives across the country teaching people technical skills. And it was by far the biggest project that I've ever undertaken. And I remember the night before that we were gonna actually sign the agreement for these vehicles and buy a fleet of vehicles. I remember talking to one of our board members who is a very, very well-known influential tech leader, may or may not have a company here down the road in the space, in e-commerce. And I remember having a conversation with him, and I remember saying, I'm an accountant. That was at that time, that was where I had come from. I had worked in accounting. I remember saying, I am so risk averse. I don't know if I can do this, right? I don't know if I can actually launch this project. And I remember him being okay, I'm gonna stop you right there. You have only ever demonstrated your ability to take risks and be innovative. You are just telling yourself that you are risk averse or you're accountant for whatever reason. And so he actually really encouraged me to think about and unlearn the ways that I was describing myself that were limiting my ability to do something. I remember hanging up and crying. And again, that maybe you've had an experience like this too, but that was really profound for me. It took though an external event for me to see. And then I went through that process in a lot of different ways to say, okay, that's no longer serving me, and I am not that person, right? I had to unlearn the way that I was talking about myself that was limiting me from doing what I wanted to be doing, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Melissa. We're gonna end here, and I'd like to invite you, if you have questions, if you're a little bit shy now, you can always approach Melissa after the presentation and ask her in person. Thank you, Melissa.
Great. Thank you.
Now, an interesting fact on your presentation. Tomorrow is the last day that you can actually order DVDs from Netflix. So after all these years, they're actually stopping the distribution. And anybody who orders today will actually be able to keep their DVDs. So hint, if you have a DVD player, which most of us don't anymore, but that's the big news. They still had 5 distribution centers across the US for their DVDs. They had over 1 million customers still. So thank you for that, very interesting. And of course, there's one Blockbuster, and it's in Alaska. So, and so they probably will order a lot of DVDs right now from Netflix. So on behalf of DPI and our affiliates, I'd like to thank you, Melissa, for the great presentation and for joining us today and sharing your knowledge. And a big thank you to all our affiliates in person and especially online with the great numbers for joining us today. Your feedback is instrumental. I've mentioned it earlier. Feedback helps us to be able to plan for the future, the events and the activities that we do, and provide the proper learning or unlearning. Maybe would be we could look at that approach as well. So we ask you to take the time to complete our feedback survey. It's really key for the approach that we take here at DPI. We have a networking event coming up on October 12th. For those in the NCR, please join us in person and keep the conversation going. There will be networking and meeting with colleagues from across departments. We also have a seminar in October, so please check our website and register for upcoming events. The seminar will be around cyber, so a very interesting speaker And so check the website with the details, and please register early so we can plan ahead for this event. And with that, I'll wish you a great rest of your day, and have a nice weekend for those who start early.